This morning I want to talk to you about just one verse. It's Mark chapter 15 and verse 21. So the whole sermon is about this one verse and about one particular person, a man named Simon of Cyrene. Here's the verse. And they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. This morning I want to ask two questions. The first question is, what can we learn about Simon of Cyrene? And the second question is, what can we learn from Simon of Cyrene? Now that first question, what can we learn about Simon of Cyrene? We're going to have to look at some historical details and facts. I loved getting ready for that part of the sermon. That's seminary professor stuff, right? Going and finding all the historical background to the Bible and trying to find some details about this one particular man. The second half of the sermon, we'll look at the question, what can we learn from Simon and Cyrene? And here I want you to help me by using your imagination. What if Simon of Cyrene could speak to us and tell us about what he learned from his encounter from Jesus? So I hope you're willing to imagine with me what Simon might be able to say to us. So let's start with that first question. What can we learn about Simon of Cyrene? The answer is not that much. But there are a few historical details that I can point out. In fact, I have 6 pieces of information, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of information about this man. Number 1, Simon at some point lived in Africa. He's identified as coming from Cyrene. Cyrene was a city on the northern coast of Africa, right by the Mediterranean Sea. Right now, it would be in the country of Libya. So that's one thing we know, at least for some point in his life, he lived in Africa. Number 2, Simon was Jewish. Simon is a Jewish name. We might think if Simon was from Africa, it would be unlikely that he would be Jewish, but that's not actually true. One estimate from that time is that 25% of the population of Cyrene was Jewish. There was a large Jewish population there. In fact, during the time of Jesus, there were more people living outside the land of Israel than inside the land of Israel. And these Jews living outside the land of Israel were called the Jews of the diaspora. And some of them lived in Africa, and including the city of Cyrene. Now, if Simon is from Africa, he's Jewish, why is he in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus? Well, there's a couple possibilities here. One is that Simon lived earlier in his life in Cyrene in Africa, and then he moved to Jerusalem or someplace near Jerusalem. Another possibility is that Simon was simply in Jerusalem visiting for the Passover ceremony. Now, if I had to guess, I would guess that Simon actually moved to the city of Jerusalem. Now, I want to point out a verse. It's Acts chapter 13 and verse 1. In Acts chapter 13, it's talking about the teachers, the leaders of the church in Antioch during those early years of the church. Antioch is a city north of Jerusalem in Israel. And it's listing out the teachers there, and I'm not reading the whole verse, but you'll notice that there was a man there by the name of Lucius of Cyrene. In other words, at some point in his life, he lived in Cyrene, and then he came to live in Antioch and was a leader of the church in Antioch. I think something similar happened with Simon of Cyrene. At one point in his life, he lived in Africa, and then he moved to Jerusalem, and came to be known as Simon from Cyrene. There's no real reason to call someone Simon of Cyrene if you're just visiting for a few days. 1, 2, 3. Third, I think that Simon of Cyrene probably became a Christian, a follower of Jesus. Now, let me take you back to Mark 15:21. One of the details that's mentioned here is that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. That leaves the impression that the Christians who first read Mark's gospel knew Alexander and Rufus. Mark's writing his gospel, and he's talking about Simon of Cyrene, and he stops and says, oh, and by the way, that's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And you kind of assume that the people who first heard about Mark's gospel and heard from Mark, they thought to themselves, oh, I know Alexander and Rufus, they're Christians like me. Huh? And if the children were Christians, it seems like there's a good chance that Simon, the father, was a Christian as well. Now, there's one other interesting clue, and it shows up in Romans chapter 16 and verse 13. In the 2nd century, when Christians wrote about Mark's gospel and talked about it, they mentioned that Mark was in the city of Rome when he wrote his book. So the Christians who first read Mark's gospel were in Rome. Well, it's interesting that when Paul wrote to the church in Rome, he also mentioned someone by the name of Rufus. In Romans chapter 16 and verse 13, it says this, "Greet Rufus, a choice man in the Lord, also his mother and mine." Now, I don't think that this was actually Paul's mother. It was like she had been a mother to him, just like I'm sure she had been like a mother to many others. But here, Paul mentions Rufus. Was this Rufus the same man that Mark mentions? Well, I think there's a good chance that it was. Mark was writing to the church of Rome, Paul's writing to the church of Rome, and they perhaps mention this same person, who's obviously a Christian, and his mother is a Christian. I'm assuming that Simon of Cyrene was a Christian as well. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4. Now, this one is more guesswork, okay? I think that perhaps Simon, or perhaps his father, was a freed slave. A freed slave. Now, I'm getting this from Acts chapter 6 and verse 9. Acts chapter 6 is talking about a man named Stephen, who was a powerful proclaimer of Jesus in the city of Jerusalem in those very, very early days of the church. And in this particular chapter, it's mentioned that there were some people who argued against him, Jews from a particular synagogue. All right, it says this, "And some men from what was called the synagogue of the freedmen, including both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and some from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and argued with Stephen." During the time of Jesus, there were many synagogues in the city of Jerusalem, and one of them was particularly for freed slaves. And Acts tells us that many of those freed slaves came from Cyrene. There were Cyrenians there. And so at least it's a possibility that Simon of Cyrene was associated in some way with that particular synagogue and may have been from a family of freed slaves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's another educated guess. My guess is that Simon of Cyrene was probably an anti-Roman Jewish patriot, that he was unhappy with the Roman Empire, that he was unhappy with Roman soldiers in Jerusalem. He was probably antagonistic to the Roman Empire. Remember when I said that there were Jews living outside the land of Israel and they were called Jews of the diaspora? Of all the Jews of the diaspora, the ones that were the most antagonistic to the Roman Empire and most willing to rebel against them were the Jews living in the city of Cyrene. In fact, there were 2 times when the Jews in Cyrene actually came into rebellion against the Roman Empire, violent rebellion against the Romans. Many people know that the Jews in AD 66 in Jerusalem rebelled against the Roman Empire. And eventually the Roman army came in and destroyed the temple and conquered the city of Jerusalem. But hardly anybody knows that during that very same time, the Jews in Cyrene, in order to support the rebellion in Israel, rose up and attacked the Roman garrison in that city. A man by the name of Jonathan gathered up 2,000 Jewish men and attacked the Roman army in the city of Cyrene. They were defeated, and Jonathan was sent to Rome to be executed. And then it happened again. In AD 115, the Jews in the city of Cyrene rebelled against the Roman Empire, and they were actually able to take over the city of Cyrene. And they gathered an even larger army and decided that they would march through Egypt, come to the city of Jerusalem, and set Jerusalem free. But in Egypt, they ran into the Roman army and they were defeated. So these were people who were angry about the Roman Empire, and my guess is that Simon shared in that pervasive attitude of antagonism toward Roman rule. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm on 6. And this point is simply that Simon was forced to help Jesus. Now, I think it helps to take a look at Mark chapter 15 and verse 21 again. There it says that Simon was pressed into service. He was compelled. He was forced to help Jesus. He did not volunteer to do this. The ordeal of crucifixion usually began with a scourging. The prisoner was whipped or beaten. Now, when Jews beat a prisoner, the Old Testament law said you could only hit him 40 times, and so they carefully would count up to 39 to make sure they did not go over the limit. That was not true of the Romans. The Romans just beat you as long as they wanted to beat you. And a Roman whip was long strands of leather, and tied into the leather were pieces of metal or bone or broken glass. And when the prisoner was beaten, their whole back would be shredded. Well, this happened to Jesus. The next step was that the prisoner was required to carry the cross to his place of execution. Usually, it was just the cross beam, not the whole cross, but the cross beam. And the prisoner would carry that out to the place of execution. The post or the staff would be already in the ground there. The prisoner would be nailed to the cross beam and then attached to the post and left there to die. So Jesus was required to carry his crossbeam as part of his punishment. But apparently, because of the severe beating that Jesus received from the Romans, he actually fell under the weight of the crossbeam, collapsed, and wasn't able to carry the cross. And so the soldiers in charge of bringing him out to the place of execution looked around, and they found a person passing by. It happened to be Simon, and they required him to carry the cross for Jesus. It's not like Jesus fell under the weight of the cross and Simon rushed forward to help. Jesus, let me help you. No, he was forced to do that. So this is what we know about Simon. He was a Jewish man. At some point in his life, he lived in Africa. He may have been a freed slave or the descendant of a freed slave. He was probably angry about Roman rule and ironically was forced by the Roman soldiers to carry the cross for Jesus. And I believe that he became a follower of Jesus as well. Well, that's what we know about Simon of Cyrene, but what can we learn from him? And we can know some basic facts, but what did Simon learn from his encounter with Jesus? And what can we learn from him? Is there a lesson for us? Now, when I was working on this message, I kept thinking, it would be so nice if I could just send an email to Simon of Cyrene and say to him, what did you learn? What did you learn from your encounter with Jesus? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, maybe people in heaven have started using email. I mean, who knows? Maybe. And so I just started randomly sending out emails to Simon of Cyrene at gmail.com, or I tried Simon of Cyrene at heaven.net. I don't think there's a heaven.net, but I tried it anyways, right? And then just as a joke, because I thought it was funny, I tried Simon of Cyrene at bsop.edu.ph. All the students at BSOP, they all have to use an email, and they're given an email that always ends with at bsop.edu.ph. So I sent it off, Simon of Cyrene at bsop.edu.ph, and I was shocked. I got an email back from him at the BSOP email address. Wow, BSOP's closer to heaven than I thought, right? And he sent me this wonderful, long explanation of what he had learned from his encounter with Jesus. And it was such a wonderful email, I decided that I would read it to you today. Are you okay with that? Can I read you this email? All right, you have to relax because this is a pretty long email. All right, here it is. Dear Dr. Williams, or should I call you Joel of Metro Manila, you asked me about what I learned from my encounter with Jesus. It was such a thought-provoking question for me that I could not resist sending you a reply. So I decided to answer your email. Here's what you can tell the people at Grace Christian Church. I learned that the most important thing I ever did for Jesus was a task I did not choose. There's an important principle here. The most important thing you might ever do for Jesus is a task you would never choose. I will explain more about that later. You sent along the information that you were planning to share about me in your message. Most of it is correct, except for the part about why I was in Jerusalem. Why was I there? That is a more complicated question, and it involves my family and the times we moved. My father was a Jewish slave in Cyrene. He was trained by his master to serve as a business manager. When my father was set free, he continued to work for the same man, but now as a freedman and an employee. That's why I grew up in Cyrene in a Jewish family. I met with my wife, Miriam, at our synagogue there. As you mentioned, we had 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus. When those boys were still young, we decided to bring them to Jerusalem for Passover. I wanted them to see the temple and to understand their heritage and their faith. It was during that visit that I met Jesus and became a follower of Jesus. My whole family believed in him as well. Because of that, we decided to stay in Jerusalem and live there during those early and exciting days of the church in Jerusalem. That is how I came to be called Simon of Cyrene. There were so many men named Simon in the early church that every Simon needed an extra addition to their name, including Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot, both disciples of Jesus. When the persecution started in Jerusalem, we stayed there even in the midst of all the difficulties. But finally, we found it necessary to return to Cyrene. My son Alexander settled down in Cyrene. He married, raised a family, and served as an elder in the church there. My son Rufus took an interesting path in life. After my death, he decided that there was nothing holding him in Cyrene. He felt called by God to move to a place where the church was growing and where the church could use his help and leadership. He first moved to Corinth, taking along his mother. That is where they first met the Apostle Paul. Later, they moved to Rome to help in the church there, in that city. As you can see, my family's movements were complicated, and I do not blame you for finding it difficult to sort out all of that exactly right. So, what did I learn from my encounter with Jesus? I learned that the most important thing that I ever did for him was a task I did not choose. In fact, it was a task I never would have chosen. Let me take you back to that most important day in my life. You have no idea how crowded Jerusalem could be during Passover time. We stayed outside the city in a tent, and our pattern was to wake up early in order to crowd through the city gate in the morning and slowly make our way through the packed streets of the city, and then spend the day at the temple complex. That morning, as we started getting closer to the temple, the pushing and shoving of the crowd suddenly grew worse. Roman soldiers were pushing the crowd to the side of the street in order to make way for a condemned criminal who was carrying his crossbeam to the place of execution. In the press of the crowd, I realized that Alexander was no longer holding my hand. I looked around to find him and to look for my wife, who was holding on to Rufus. I could not see any of them, and it shook me to lose sight of my boys. At that point, I felt two strong hands grab my shoulders and throw me into the open space in the middle of the street. The criminal had collapsed. He was face down in the dirt under the heavy weight of the crossbeam. A soldier was beating him with a stick, screaming at him to stand up. The whole thing was so unfair. The Roman soldiers treated everyone like their own personal slaves. They were demanding that I carry the crossbeam for this man. Why didn't the soldiers help with this cross? It was their job. Where were the man's family members or friends? In fact, where's my wife and my sons? I strained around to look for them in the midst of the crowd. A blow to the back of my head reminded me that I did not have a choice. I kept thinking, I'm the innocent one here. Why should I bear the cross for the guilty? Now I feel so ashamed that that thought ever came into my mind. The crossbeam was set on my back, and I walked last in the procession behind the soldiers, pushing the crowd out of the way, behind the condemned man. And we pushed and stumbled our way through one of the city gates and up a hill to the place of the skull where executions took place. I threw that cross off my back. That's not mine. It belongs to another. And then I suddenly found myself face to face with the condemned man. It was like time stood still long enough for me to see with open eyes. The man was wearing a cruel crown made of twisted branches filled with sharp thorns that dug into his forehead. I don't know how, and I can't explain it, but when I faced the condemned man, I immediately recognized him as my king. All my life, I had longed for the Messiah to come. And here I was standing in front of him, face to face. He was beaten and bleeding, but somehow completely in control of the situation. He looked at me and said, "Thank you for what you did for me." And those words just hung in the air for me to ponder. The sting of a Roman whip tearing my shirt and back informed me that I was no longer welcome there. The sky was growing dark, and I rushed off to search for my family. I will never forget those words. Thank you for what you did for me. In my mind, I did not take on this task for him. In fact, I did not even choose it. It was forced on me. But somehow my king recognized that it was an act of service for him. The most important thing I ever did for Jesus was a task I did not choose. In my life, I often had the opportunity to explain this thought to other believers. The most important thing you might ever do for Jesus is a task you would never choose. I never met a believer who chose to have a child with special needs, a child who could not see or hear or speak or walk. I never met a believer who chose to have a rebellious son, a son who walked away from God in order to live in shameful ways. I never met a believer who chose to live with financial difficulties or with extended sickness. The list could go on and on because life is difficult and often unfair. But what if Jesus came to you and said, "Would you carry this heavy burden for me?" What would you say? Jesus wants his followers to reflect his love to broken people, to lost people. What if Jesus came to you and said, "Would you do this for me?" Jesus wants his followers to show the world that we do not serve him for financial gain, for personal gain, but only because we know he is worthy of all of our love. Would you do that for Jesus? In life, I often found it necessary to explain all of this to other believers who face difficult tasks that they never chose. These unchosen tasks can be done for Jesus. I always end these conversations by telling them to remember that someday you will stand before your King face to face. He knows all the difficult tasks that you never chose, the ones that you were forced to do, the ones that seemed so unfair. And he will say to you, "Thank you for what you did for me." Please tell the people at Grace Christian Church that this one sentence from our King is the greatest reward they could ever receive. Signed, your brother in Christ, Simon of Cyrene.